Oh, there it is. Hi, Saturday Cactus Con. How's it going? Good? I love it. That's so good. Great. Welcome to our keynote. I'm so excited to introduce Selena. I don't remember meeting Selena because it was a long time ago. But I was listening to one of her excellent podcasts, Only Malware in the Building. Have you heard that one? If not, you should. Yeah, okay. You got some fans. And thinking about the theme this year. So our theme this year is not as overt as it has been in the past, like not quite so big Hacktar is watching you. But thinking about how, yes, AI, many things have changed, but we still have the same old vulnerabilities, the same old problems that AI is either accelerating or just papering over. And so as I put on the podcast, Selena's voice came on and said, you know how AI is changing a lot of things, but we still have those same old vulnerabilities? And I went, my keynote, hooray! So excellent timing on that one. So Selena is can't see anything anymore. Selena's a staff threat researcher at Proofpoint on the threat research team and leads intelligence and strategy for cybercrime. She collaborates with fellow researchers to identify and investigate advanced threats and develop actionable threat intelligence. She hosts, as I mentioned, Only Malware in the Building, but also Discarded, which both feature unique research and insight from a lot of interesting people in InfoSec, and previously was a cyber threat analyst for Dragos and a privacy and cyber journalist. Her dog, Ben, loves the snow. And so Ben means he's been the happiest inhabitant of Washington, D.C. in the past couple of weeks. So everyone, please welcome Selena.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to hang out with me today. Yes, Ben is loving the snow, including today's -4 real feel in Washington, D.C., which is why I am delighted to be here in Arizona. It is so fantastic to be here and hanging out with all of you guys. I'm also holding a handheld because I cannot stand in one place for an extended period of time. I will be wandering around the stage. So yeah, I'm Selena. I work at Proofpoint, and today I'm going to talk about something that's very near and dear to my heart, actually. I have been thinking about this for quite some time because I don't really like AI. Gen AI. I think that it can be a very useful productivity tool, but I think the way that we talk about it and communicate it has gotten really muddy. There's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of bad communication. There's a lot of buzzwords. And today I kind of wanted to talk about differentiating hype versus reality and what I think the real threat from AI is to us and our communities. A little bit of a backstory. I already got this great introduction, so I don't really need to go too into that. But yeah, I focus mostly on cybercrime. So everything from business email compromise and fraud to initial access brokers delivering ransomware. The talk yesterday, Kadi's talk about how ransomware can actually impact healthcare was really, really great because that's this type of thing that I am trying to disrupt and stop from happening. And I am a former journalist, so I actually went to the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. Go Devils! And I grew up here in Mesa, Arizona, actually, and I hadn't been back for quite some time. In fact, I think when I was here last time, the ASU campus wasn't even built yet. So it's really cool to see this amazing city and growth and talk to all of you here in my hometown. This is very special to me. Talking about, I just love crime. So this is really exciting for me. So TLDR, AI is everywhere, but people are too. And if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this talk is that it can be a useful tool, but humans are still required to be in the loop no matter what we are doing, what we are building, what we are creating, or what we are disrupting. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, large language models, these are all changing the ways that we work. But it's also changing the ways that threat actors work, the ways that hackers work. And honestly, it's very similar. Detection against threats largely remains the same, though. And we're going to kind of highlight some of the ways that the objectives and the activities and tactic techniques and procedural changes are not necessarily modifying anything that you have to do from the defense perspective because they're still trying to do the same stuff, just with AI-enabled tooling. In order to be efficient, again, there must always be a human in the loop. We're going to show some examples of how I and my team use AI as sort of a productivity tool and enhancement, and how we are collaborating with real human researchers to make stuff that actually works. And then finally, this is the kind of important thing to me, but I do think that AI can be very detrimental to our society and our humanity. And I think we have to be very, very careful when we're thinking about building these tools, think about ethics, thinking about social responsibility, thinking about how the things we are creating can have an impact on people and the human beings that are relying on our technologies and exist in a very computer, technical, internet-enabled world. Quick note, there is a brief mention of self-harm at the end of this talk, so I just wanted to warn people. It's just a headline, but just kind of wanted to have that in there. So, quick poll, have you ever used AI tools? Yes. Everyone's hands are up in the air. That is no surprise, right? It's just become integrated into our lives. I also use AI-enabled tooling. I've tried some that is very bad, and I've tried some that's very effective, which leads me to my next question. Have your AI tools ever malfunctioned, requiring manual fixes? Yes, hopefully those same hands are up. Because again, we are developing these toolings with our subject matter expertise. We are incorporating things into our workflow, but oftentimes they don't have the same human reasoning, human understanding. And look, humans are going to have to debug things until the end of time. It's just the reality. So we are definitely kind of in this space where we are making these things, and it's kind of moving fast and breaking things, which is actually the exact opposite of what we want to be doing with artificial intelligence. One of the questions that I get asked all the time, how are threat actors using artificial intelligence? What's going on? What is the cyber threat landscape? And I want to say, well, how are you using artificial intelligence? And then they are probably doing similar things. But one thing that we are seeing a lot of change in is social engineering. Who here is a social engineer, consider themselves to be a social engineer? I just social engineered you into putting your hands up. Nah, but I am not a social engineer. I actually have someone on my team who his whole job is to hack the hackers basically and get back to try and get as much information from them as he possibly can. And it is crazy listening to his different personas and his different voices. And I'm just like, that is too hard for me. So social engineering, I like to refer to it as brain hacking because you don't really need to have a very technical adept or a technical specific type of tooling in order to get people to take risky actions or to do something like put your hands up. And social engineering, what we see from an email threat perspective, and again, proof point, the work that I do is very much focused on email as initial access. So we see a lot of email that is likely to be created by LLMs. The main thing that we're seeing the most of, though, in terms of actual changes to the landscape is the ability for AI and little GPTs that threat actors are using to be able to produce emails that have a lot more natural human language in more languages. So Google Translate and tools like that used to be very effective for things like English, a lot of very common languages, but they weren't very good at producing natural sounding language for things like Japanese, for example. And I didn't want to include a Japanese one because I don't speak Japanese, and so I wouldn't be able to describe what it was doing, but here's a couple of English language examples that we do suspect are created using LLMs. So on the left, you have a campaign that I unearthed. I tracked Tycoon, which is a multi-factor authentication phishing kit. A lot of different threat actors use Tycoon, and some of them are terrible with their email lures, and some of them have adopted the sort of LLM-generated things. And there are a lot of different characteristics that you can see. They're a lot longer, typically. They're using a lot more varied type of language. It tends to sometimes be a little bit more targeted or specific to like a vertical or something. In this case, it's like events-based. You have all these like bolded words that are highlighted that you can kind of tell, oh yes, this is, they prompted an LLM to produce this based off of being, an event that they're trying to host. And in this case, it delivered a Tycoon information stealer. On the right-hand side, you see another very common threat actor that we track a lot. They deliver Transfer Loader. This is a very sophisticated threat actor, and Transfer Loader is a very interesting malware that often leads to ransomware. And you can see here that they use a lot of very similar like AI-generated, LLM-generated stuff. They pose as like people looking for jobs, things like that. And so their lures are pretty well done. Then, of course, you have things like this. So this is an example, again, social engineering using business email compromise. And I think this example is just crazy because so this is using multi-persona impersonation. So the threat actor will basically pretend to be multiple different people within an organization and create these personas to go back and forth, fake a conversation, and they'll always use things like turnkey engagement, KPIs, milestones, exit options, CapEx or OpEx, risk controls, all these words that, they ask an LLM, okay, if I'm talking to a CEO, if I'm talking to a VP of sales, like what are things that I would do? We also see them crafting personas using LLMs, and looking for different people to target. So target selection, target development is a thing that threat actors definitely use this for. And then also being able to very quickly edit and modify their existing templates for phishing. So I just really like this, and then it continues. So the second part of the thread is the impersonated executives that are redirected to like the legitimate accounts payable, and they CC these actor-controlled email addresses. But the nonsense just keeps going. KPI framework, track impact, growth plan, trajectory, like. Okay. I mean, I'm not a business person. I'm sure these are very common emails to see, but I like that they're using this. But this is how I feel. Whenever I see AI generated content in any way, I ain't reading all that, like. And this is actually not just unique to emails, right? Like this is something that we see with a lot of written content, is that it's just not you can tell that it's computer generated. It sort of lacks a little bit of humanity. And while it's fine for some things like short emails or things like this, I actually tell my team, and I really encourage people who are cyber threat intelligence practitioners who are producing content, don't use AI to write your research. Make sure that you're collaborating with somebody. I tell them, I'm like, look, you can send me your notes and I'll be your own personal Selena GPT. Because it's so important, and this is why I kind of think about it from my journalism perspective, that there's kind of a lack, there's a little bit of miscommunication between what things actually are happening, very technical people that have these concepts, and actually communicating them to a broader audience. And if you don't effectively communicate threats in a way that a human can understand and not feel this way when they're reading your work, they're not going to be able to take action on that information and actually operationalize intelligence. And so in the same way that threat actors are kind of just dumping a lot of junk, we kind of see that a little bit in the world when people are creating things that might be a little bit difficult to read and consume from a human perspective. Another thing that we see all the time in terms of threat actor use of LLMs are scripts. Every single kind of script you could possibly imagine, we have seen created with LLMs, from a lot of different ones too. And here we have a couple of examples. So on the left, this was a PowerShell script that was recaptcha.ps1 containing LLM generated content. And in this particular case, there was a URL in an email that led to this script file that, if executed, would download and install Xworm. Xworm is a very common malware payload used by cybercriminal threat actors. And you can actually see there's evidence within the actual content that shows like at what point the LLM output was. So they always have these comments. The comments are quite wordy. The way that it's structured, it always follows a very similar structure and process. So if you're an analyst and you take a look at a script and you're like, oh yeah, like within a couple of seconds, you'd say, oh yeah, that's probably LLM generated. And one of the things that I like to find in these LLM generated scripts are when their comments are in multiple different languages. Because then you think, okay, this might have been a script that was available in open source or that was purchased from a provider, and then they ended up running it through their own, that was LLM generated. Maybe that developer was English, then they ran it through their own LLM, but they are Russian speaking. And so you might see Russian speaking comments alongside English speaking comments, and they literally never bothered to delete the comments. So it is very interesting, and oftentimes you can use this type of thing for attribution purposes. So it's not 100%, of course, because there's always buying and selling of a lot of distinct malware, scripts, injects, things like that. But if you're looking at a piece of malware, or you're looking at a script or a piece of infection chain that you think is potentially LLM generated, and you can see the output from the LLM in the notes in the code, and if they don't do very good OPSEC and don't delete those, if it's a very unique piece of malware or script that you're looking at, you don't see it ever in your own traffic or data, you might be able to sort of build a picture, at least help with a hypothesis and attribution on what language that actor is speaking. So we have another example here on the right you can see it has Russian language code. So in this case, this was messages containing URLs utilizing the 404 TDS, which I'm not going to be talking about today, but that is a very interesting TDS used by cybercriminal threat actors. And this will redirect users after filtering to a landing page that actually uses the click fix technique. So this is an example of the click fix technique script that is used in the overall attack chain. And you can see that the comments are actually in Russian. In this case, I don't know, is everyone familiar with the click fix technique? We're going to talk about it in just a second. Just a couple of you. Great. Okay. Yeah. So it's essentially a little technique that encourages users to copy, paste, and run PowerShell on their own host. It's a little pop-up. It's used very, very frequently. And we see a lot of click fix scripts that are using LLM generated content. So in this case, the comments were in Russian, and it led to the installation of ZGRAT. So kind of interesting to see how scripts are working. Now, I want to talk about some fails, because even though we do see some things that do work, leveraging LLMs and artificial intelligence and GPTs, we also see things that don't work. So UNC drop pitch, and UNC is the way that we classify uncategorized threat actors that we don't necessarily attribute to a particular state government operation, like the PLA, for example, in China. But in this case, UNC drop pitch is suspected to be a China-aligned threat actor. And they began in the middle of last year completely changing their tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs. And it was very weird. And my China analyst was like, wait a second, what is going on? So they were making, they had this malware, they had this attack chain, they had these emails that didn't really make sense and were distinct shifts from their previous behaviors. So the C2 protocol was bespoke, but very basic. It had 2 different sets of fake TLS headers for really no reason at all. The archive files that came with were packaged with these really obscure and weird audio files, video recordings, explicit images, just text files that contained this like nonsensical information. And their email lures were absolutely terrible. So here's just an example of how it kind of failed. So again, this is an example of UNC drop pitch. So the sender email addresses rarely match the display name, and they never matched the persona within the referenced email body. So they were completely mismatched. And historically, this actor was pretty good at their targeting. They also increased the volume of targeting and the scope of targets, which was also very unusual for them. They tend to be a little bit more focused, and they have a little bit more sort of one-on-one interaction. They also had these email signatures that had these completely fake phone numbers that just didn't exist, and addresses that would begin with 123 and a street that didn't exist in the country that it was saying it was existing in. So the persona matching was just really terrible. It didn't really work. The malware was off. Things weren't really functioning. And I actually have an episode of my Discarded podcast talking to Mark Kelly, who was the analyst on this drop pitch activity, diving more into how they failed so badly, which is a fun listen if you're into that sort of thing and interested in tracking China actors. And what was interesting was it didn't work. So clearly this AI-enabled attack chain that they were using wasn't super effective. And so what they ended up doing was the actor pivoted away from experimenting with this AI-generated content and really went back to using these tried and true TTPs. So its phishing emails returned to normal, the normal level, the sort of lower volume of activity, and now it's trying to engage targets one-on-one using a little bit more authentic social engineering and those techniques that they have really perfected over the years. My analyst was delighted. He was so happy to see that, because it's not very fun looking at attack chains that are bad and broken and don't really work. So he was very excited to see them go back to normal. So the question is, okay, here is how threat actors are using AI and LLM generated content in email attack chains. And you can kind of expand that to other types of initial access, malware development, script development, tooling for lateral movement. But does it really matter if they're using AI or LLM to create these techniques and these attack chains? I would say it matters insofar as they can augment and increase their attack velocity. They can probably make more phishing lures. We've seen some credential phishing campaigns that have 12 languages in one campaign because they're using this sort of automated scripting to create these templates. So that's one thing. Yes, it can do that. But ultimately, the objectives remain the same. And to kind of highlight why, it's interesting to talk about the use cases of AI and LLMs, it's also important to remember that we still have great defense against these campaigns. So I want to talk briefly about TA584 as one case study. This is a very fun threat actor. It is a prominent initial access broker that targets organizations globally. It has significantly increased its attack velocity over the last year. And I did recently give a talk at CNCTI if you want to learn more about this particular threat actor, and we published a deep dive on the blog and malware reversing that we did with their payloads if you guys are interested in that type of thing. I'm not going to get too much into it, but I wanted to use TA584 because it uses so many different TTPs that are common across the threat landscape. So it's kind of a really great little tempest in a teapot of everything together that we're seeing in the landscape supported with just one threat actor. And if you're defending against the techniques and tactics that TA584 is using, you would have good defense against what's very popular across the landscape. So the delivery methods with URLs with aggressive filtering, use of various TDSs, including 404 TDS, which again is very interesting. They do have these geofencing landing pages. They do have very good customization with their social engineering, with their geo-specific targeting. They will have the languages and the lures match the specific region, the specific verticals that they're targeting. And they also use a technique called EtherHiding. In their one of their malware uses a technique called EtherHiding. EtherHiding is a fairly new technique that basically uses the Binance Smart Chain contracts to host the command and control. Essentially acts like basically a bulletproof hoster using this Web3 technology. And then finally, the TTP is significantly shifted into 2025 alongside kind of the overall e-crime threat landscape, which again, we can kind of see how it mirrors what's out there. You can kind of think of defense for overall e-crime. So with some of their campaign lures, it's not necessarily that TA584 uses AI or LLM to develop a lot of these things. I just want to kind of throw that out there. I'm just kind of using it as an example of their techniques mostly. But they do have a wide variety of emails. So they'll have this like one sentence email. My favorite one, oh, congratulations on the parking ticket. I accidentally got your parking ticket. Happy Thanksgiving. Whoops. That's an interesting lure that they use. They also had this like court lure, but they also like impersonate brands regularly, which I'll show you an example of in just a second. But they typically target hundreds of organizations with message volumes ranging from a few thousand to nearly 200,000 messages per campaign. So they're pretty prolific, and their TTPs are really widespread. They use compromised senders for mail delivery, which is something that we see a lot with the cybercrime email threat landscape. That doesn't really have anything to do with AI, but I just included that for interest. So this is what an actual campaign will look like. And like I said, they do have these like very well-designed lures too. It's not just all saying congratulations on your parking ticket. They like to like impersonate these brands, and it's possible that they are using some sort of AI tooling or some sort of scripting to be able to build these very believable brand impersonations. Then the messages in these brand impersonations will contain a URL that leads to a customized landing page with a slide CAPTCHA. Now, CAPTCHAs are something that we're seeing basically everywhere. Threat actors are constantly trying to make sure that only their targets and a real human being are actually interacting with whatever the threat is. And so these, in many cases, can sort of bypass sandboxing because a human interaction is required. So we see a lot of different CAPTCHAs, and they're constantly changing them because we are constantly keeping up with them and adding new detections, right? Like the community sees a new CAPTCHA, we write detections for it, we can block it, and the threat actors make a new one. And so the CAPTCHA and the injects that are used for this full chain are often used and developed with LLM tooling and scripting. And you can kind of see the comments on some of the different CAPTCHAs that are developed when they very quickly come on the landscape. So in this case, this is an example of ClickFix. So if you're not familiar, because only a few people raised your hands, the far right picture where it says this verification step is there. I think this is an absolutely fantastic example of social engineering. When a user sees this pop up on a compromised website that they have clicked on, they see this thing that looks very real. It essentially copy, paste, and run this script on your computer, and you can completely fix this problem. Here's a problem that you got. Here are the steps to fix it. Now, how many people within an organization like talking to IT and waiting on those tickets and getting their stuff sorted? I actually love our IT team, so I often talk to them. But a lot of times people are like, I'm just gonna bypass this. Like, I'm just gonna fix this myself. Look, these beautiful instructions teach me how to fix it. In this way, the threat actor actually is making someone feel enabled, or is feeling a positive idea instead of having like a negative reaction, trying to get them to take a negative action. It's almost like a positive reaction. And this has taken over the threat landscape. Dozens of cybercrime threat actors are using ClickFix in their attack chains to deliver malware. And a lot of the ClickFix scripts that we are now seeing popping up, it was actually initially popularized by some open source stuff posted in open source and some tooling. Look at this weird thing. And then it was adopted within 2 days after it was posted on GitHub. So think about that before you release hacking tools in the general public, because they are very quickly adopted, and it has expanded and exploded to all of e-crime. But yeah, so this is how, once you copy, paste, and run the PowerShell, it ends up communicating to the C2, and it downloads either Xworm or SendiriBot. Now, Xworm is a very common malware. Again, like I mentioned, we had an example earlier that was delivering malware. In this case, SendiriBot, or Xworm, is being delivered with the power configuration. And in many cases, this is a remote access Trojan, and it does have, in some cases, like ransomware capability. It's used by a variety of different threat actors, from like the most basic, not very good in my opinion, kind of boring threat actors, all the way up to like high sophistication TF584 threat actors. And then SendiriBot is a pretty interesting backdoor and loader malware that could potentially deliver ransomware, again, as it is used by an initial access broker and has become pretty popular. This is the one that actually uses EtherHiding for their C2 comps, and is increasingly popular. An increasingly popular technique that we see in various different malware. North Korea even uses EtherHiding in some of their malware, so it's really an interesting technique that's expanding. But defense against all of this remains the same. So regardless of whether they're using AI to generate their PowerShell, using AI to write this malware, using AI to send these emails, we're still going to defend against it the same way that we have been pre-AI. So you restrict users from running PowerShell. This is a little crazy, but consider disabling Windows run function for users who like don't need it for their jobs. If you can monitor for the usage of Node.js, this is something that's specific for the SendiriBot. Block or monitor Ethereum endpoints, something that applies to the EtherHiding technique. Implementing network detections to inspect WebSocket connections. And then finally, training users to identify things, because social engineering will always be a part of the attack chain, regardless of whether something is AI generated or not. The second case study that I wanted to talk about is this device code phishing case study. Device code phishing is really interesting. It's a technique that we initially saw being used by red teamers and threat actors. A couple of like pretty sophisticated threat actors. It wasn't widely used, and it was actually a red team tool that's available that we would see the most in our threat data. But it has exploded in the last couple of months, towards the end of 2025 into 2026. Now, device code phishing is essentially a technique that will get users to, an attacker will socially engineer somebody into logging into an application with their legitimate credentials, and then the service generates a token that is obtained by the threat actor using the real Microsoft 365 OAuth authentication flow. So essentially, it is following this existing Microsoft process, but the social engineering component of it is getting someone to log into a malicious app. Once that token is achieved, then the threat actor is granted access to the M365 instance, and then can further campaign objectives, whether that's data theft, further business email compromises, and then potentially pivoting within an organization to try and get additional follow-on activity and further embed themselves within an organization. This is a little bit of the attack flow. We do often see some of these landing pages in the same way that we have the CAPTCHAs, similar CAPTCHA. using AI or LLM generated techniques to be able to build these web pages and make them look very believable. See here, there's this counterfeit login page. It will be designed to look like a Microsoft 365 login page. And then you have, again, the device code prompt with the code, but then the person then enters and essentially gets full takeover. The flow is a little bit confusing if you're not really familiar with it, but it's the same thing of like when you have to set up your smart TV and you like scan a QR code, and then it's like, oh, input this code so your TV can talk to your phone. And then you put it in. That's basically the authentication flow. And threat actors are hijacking that, in some cases using LLM-generated landing pages or things along the way, or suspected, that essentially get full control of an O365 account. But again, regardless of what tools are being used, regardless of what the actual page will look like, defense will remain the same for these because the objectives remain the same. So blocking device code where possible, creating conditional access policies using authentication flows to block device code, using an allow list approach based on accepted use cases, requiring compliant or joined devices to prevent exploitation of this stuff. And then, of course, enhancing user awareness, making sure that people are aware of these different types of threats targeting their organization and how not to fall for them. So again, the main takeaway here is that regardless of whether an actor is using AI, LLMs to deliver and create malware or phishing, their ultimate objectives are going to remain the same. And that also means that defense against them is going to remain the same. And in many cases, these threat actors are chaining together known techniques, known TTPs, and they're sharing tooling, they're sharing malware or buying it from the same sources, and using a lot of the similar threat behaviors. So being able to defend against those threat behaviors can really help prevent exploitation, and regardless of whether someone or a threat actor is an AI boss or not. I wanted to highlight a couple of useful cases when we talk about AI as a productivity tool that we've used in my organization, and specifically one tool that was developed just for me by one of my colleagues to solve a problem that I had personally, which is very exciting. And then one case that I thought was really interesting of a threat actor using AI in terms of its own sort of malware development lifecycle. So is anyone in the audience an emerging threats community member? Do you guys use emerging threats at your organization? What? Oh my gosh. Well, I thought there would be more. So if you're not familiar, Emerging Threats is a provider of open source and commercial threat intelligence, mostly IDS, IPS rule sets, snort and Suricata signatures, stuff that is blocking the bad stuff on your network. It's great. We have the Emerging Threats provides a free open source tool as well as a sort of like pro tool for enterprises who want a little bit of additional protection. We also have an amazing, thriving community of detection engineers and people who are contributing to the rule set. So if you're not if you're not in there, or if you want to learn more about how to write IDS, IPS, snort and Suricata rules, please join. It's a great community, and we love to hear from fellow researchers out there. So in our emerging threats rule set, we had a little bit of this problem where there were some rules, some of these network detection signatures, because emerging threats has been around forever, that just didn't have a fully filled out contextualization of the rule. So whether they were missing tags and new tags that had been able to be added, for example, like MITRE ATT&CK tags, or if it had a description, a human readable description of the rule, what it was doing. So when a SOC analyst sees this rule fired in their organization, they can quickly read it and see what's going on. So we had some gaps, and what we did was we created an ML gateway that was able to create an AI tool that augmented existing rules with AI generated descriptions in cases where there was context lacking. So these rules were not written by AI. They were not written by LLMs. They were existing rules in our rule set that were just lacking some data. So we were able to basically augment over 50,000 rules with these automatically generated descriptions. Here's an example of what it actually looks like in the threat ET portal. So this is basically that description is, again, what a SOC analyst will see if there's a signature that fires in their environment. It really did say countless hours, because It would have required a human threat detection engineer to go through those 50,000 rules and make sure that they were up to date and had this human readable context. And let me tell you, those guys did not want to do that. It's also really interesting too, because, we think about how there's alert fatigue in our industry, and, it's a grind to work in the SOC. And if you are getting alerts on things that are just benign domains that don't necessarily need to be investigated versus high severity threats that are malware, you're just getting bombarded by information. And so it's a really interesting thing to think about how AI and LLM tooling could potentially be able to augment that process too. So have a little like junior SOC analyst, triage analyst, be able to read and identify and understand those rules that are coming in to reduce alert fatigue and make it a lot easier for the SOC analyst to be able to prioritize what they need to be thinking about and focusing on in their organization. So in this case, this was just for the emerging threats rule set, which is, the network detections. But it got me thinking, like, how could we sort of expand this, or how can the community expand it, or how can you and your organization use this type of tooling to reduce fatigue for your analysts and make it easier to prioritize high severity alerts that come in through your SIM? The machine learning tool was created by data scientists, and the rule descriptions were vetted by our detection engineers. So there was still a human in the loop to make sure that whatever the AI was doing, it was doing it correctly, to make sure that there were no gaps, we fixed things if needed to be fixed, and we were able to push this out to our customers, which is something, that people are always asking for, like this additional context to network detections and the rules that we're putting out. So it was pretty exciting to see the sort of culmination of this work. And now it'll say, like, this was augmented by Proofpoint Nexus AI or whatever. So like if something's AI generated, which I actually think is really, really important if we're using AI tooling to create content or to create something, to acknowledge when an AI has been a part of that process, so people are aware of what data is impacted by that. This is actually a fun little vibe-coded project that saved me countless amount of time. So basically, we have vast amounts of data. We're looking at a lot of different HIS files. And in my job, basically, we are trying to cluster campaigns. And a campaign is a set of related activity that is identified in email traffic in a time-bound time frame. And we basically want to match or correlate the threats in our data to a campaign. In many cases, the forensics that we use are pulled from a lot of different databases. And in some cases, we use these HIS files to be able to generate forensics that we can then match on these campaigns. HIS files, especially the ones that we were looking at, were enormous. And let me tell you, it was very hard to look at them sometimes. And it wasn't really easy. It was very, for me at least, there wasn't a necessarily easy method for me to automatically extract everything that I needed from a particular HIS file to be able to input it into a campaign. So my lovely team member, who's also a social engineer, he's a vibe coding social engineering master, basically. His name's Tim. So he asked Copilot, he's like, hey, I want to create this tool using like a Python script. I also want to build a GUI for it. Here's my like clip art GUI that I put together. Can you make something that would help this? This is obviously not just the only chats he used. He went through a lot of iterations and he was fixing the code, and Copilot wasn't 100% accurate all the time, which is why it's very important to be able to validate and debug things as a human being. But basically, it was just a parser to extract files and convert them into these, matching forensics that I needed to be able to cluster related sets of activity. So this is what was created. It's this lovely little GUI. So I can just upload a HIS file, select which of the forensics or the what I need from the actual file to be able to input that into this little tool, and then it will export and automatically create all of the forensics rules that I needed for my campaigns to look at and be able to cluster those effectively. Saved so much time. It was really cool. It's just like this little vibe coded tool. And this is what I think is so beneficial about AI and LLM tooling is this productivity, right? It's like, it's not necessarily taking away from the creativity of human beings, but it's sort of amplifying your ideas and making them easily, developable and saving lots and lots of time. So I can spend time doing the fun stuff, which is hunting threat actors, and less time doing the stuff that I don't like, which is writing rule forensics. So it's really important though to know that like what was required here to build this, even this little like vibe coded tool. He needed to know the original data set, what are we looking at, how our data is actually structured, and what different data pipelines we're able to pull information from. The parsed HIS values, so what is going to be in this HIS file that we can actually be able to extract and have in our forensics data. The actual rule forensics, so every single like possible rule forensics that you could potentially conceivably match for clustering threat actors, and also establish workflows. So how are people actually going to be using this tool? Why is it useful? How is it going to be used within our own organization? And why did somebody actually need to create this in the first place? He also needed to know how to prompt. That is a very special skill that can be very difficult, and actually prompting something effectively and knowing how things work is super important, because you can't just throw together a vibe coded project and like a Python script if you don't actually know Python and you don't know what you're going to be asking the LLM to do for you. So prompting is definitely a skill. And then finally, I wanted to highlight this interesting research published by Checkpoint. Has anyone actually read this research? It's pretty interesting. So it was published a couple of weeks ago now from Checkpoint, but they found this malware. It wasn't necessarily in a live campaign, but they were able to identify this new malware called VoidLink. And they were able to figure out, based off of the malware and some of the forensics and the code that they were looking at, that whoever made this malware used spec-driven development and like proper software development lifecycle to be able to build this. And it was very clean. It was very well done. And so based off of the evidence, the threat actor looks like they're a pretty experienced developer, and they do understand the malware development lifecycle and can automate development processes, planning, potentially bypassing guardrails that were actually existed in the tool that they were using to be able to create malware. And then and basically build this software that was actually malware. But malware alone isn't really mean you're a great threat actor, because this would have to be used somehow in a pretty interesting, sophisticated attack chain. So you need to be able to know malware. You have to be able to know the rest of the attack chain. But from the use case of just building malware software is pretty interesting. So in the same way that experienced software engineers are incorporating AI into their workflows to streamline processes, write tooling, speeding up development, we're seeing the same thing with malware developers as well. We're also seeing a lot of very bad malware that's written by AI and LLMs that doesn't actually work. Like I mentioned, drop pitch. So, I'm not saying that this is, a silver bullet or anything, but it was really interesting to see. But importantly, it still needs a human to debug. So that threat actor was in there. They were telling, the little LLM what they wanted. They were able to have these different processes in place. You can see that it had like this little Trey AI agent that was like writing project specifications, including like coding guidelines, architecture breakdowns. It was like documenting its software, which is really helpful. Documentation is like the most important thing in CTI. And then you had all of these other teams, so back-end core team. It's very interesting to see kind of this whole process. But you could also see how it was like debugging things. So it was telling it to do something, it was fixing it. And that's exactly kind of what we're seeing from a software development standpoint as well. So, all right, we talked about the use cases, we talked about how threat actors are using it, and now I kind of want to dive into the danger zone and what I think is the most concerning piece of this, and how we need to sort of think about artificial intelligence development, how we are sharing it within our organizations, how it's being used in our organizations, and really think about why things are being developed. So, who knows about Notebook? Yes. I don't even know what it's called now. Oh my gosh, it's been like rebranded. I think it's OpenClaw. Now there's like Claw Hub, which is like the GitHub skills database. Well, it's like a GitHub clone of AI skills. Anyway, so much has happened in like 3 weeks about this. It started off as Claudebot. Anthropic got mad. They changed it to Moltbot. I don't know why they changed it to OpenClaw. So it's been through a lot of different processes. So if you're interested in reading more, if you just Google like Moltbot or Moltbook or Claude OpenClaw, you'll find stuff about it. But essentially, so this Moltbot is an AI tool developed by one guy, again, vibe coding, that basically allows users to talk it through communication platform like Discord, Telegram, Signal. Essentially, it's an agent. It's an AI agent that lives on a host and is basically doing tasks for it. It's supposed to, make things more productive. You can tell it to do things, but it sort of sits deeply in your host. And it was, again, just this open tool that anyone could download. And unfortunately, it was full of security holes. It exploded, went super viral. People were like, oh my God, this is going to save everything. And then it ended up not being very useful. And there was a lot of security issues that were going on with Moltbot and Moltbook. And a lot of people were talking about the actual impact. So there was like exposed API keys, the skills. There's a lot of malicious skills that were being distributed. I actually just saw some research just before this presentation that talked about how a lot of malicious skills were being shared on the Claw Hub that were actually leading to Amos macOS Stealer. Really interesting stuff going on from the research side to expose all the flaws in this. Nobody should have this type of tool on their enterprise. I'm sure you guys are all would experiment with it and try and play it and have it out. But I did see people posting on LinkedIn like, oh, we have seen this in the enterprise and it is exposing data. It is exposing sensitive data that threat actors can get their hands on and potentially operationalize. It is very scary. And this is a fantastic quote from Signal's Meredith Whitaker. She spoke at an event and said the implementations of these agents we're seeing, particularly in the operating system, are perilous for our future. Perilous for our future because they need access to data. And that is what we call breaking the blood-brain barrier between the application and the operating system, because encryption no longer matters if all you have to do is just hijack this context. It is effectively root permissions running on your operating system and access to things like your Signal data. So if you're using Signal for encrypted messaging on your computer, but you give an agent access to it, it completely erodes the purpose of Signal. So Moltbot is just kind of an example of a commodity one, but we're building these things in the enterprise, and a lot of times we're building these. We want fast adoption, we want growth, but what are we turning over to this little bot, and how is it being used? How are we safeguarding data, and to ensure that they are safely being implemented and rolled out throughout our organization? So yeah, I just, if you're building these things or incorporating these things, I think security needs to be top of mind when we're building agentic AI solutions, because otherwise it could be a disaster. But to me, the real threats related to this are not whether and how threat actors are using it, but how it's impacting our lives. I was really troubled by the Grok AI and X incident where users were being able to post, to create sexually explicit images of people, including minors, and it was just distributed all over X, and there wasn't really anything done about it for quite some time. It was very, very disturbing, and a lot of people were harmed by this. I was actually a little bit disappointed in the security community because I didn't see mass outrage over this, and I think that this is one of the fundamental things that we should be so angry about. Like the fact that these AI tools don't have guardrails and they're putting like kids and women and men and children in real danger is very troubling to me. Also, your brain on ChatGPT. This was a fascinating article that showed when people were using ChatGPT to write essays, they weren't retaining any of the information. So they were just copying and pasting and not learning anything. Their brain activity, the little things stuck on your brain to measure the brain waves, that went down when they were using AI tooling. They showed that you weren't actually thinking. You're just using this AI tool to do stuff for you and not retaining any of the information. There's AI-generated videos of things like ICE raids or other things that are viral in the news that are fake and causing a lot of discord. So in addition to creating disinformation and misinformation, what it's also doing is eroding trust in our media ecosystem. So now if you look on Reddit or TikTok or Instagram, you see real news, but people are like, this is fake, this is AI. But it's not. So you have this disconnect between what's real and what isn't, and it's eroding trust in our communities and our news ecosystem and how we perceive the world. This one, again, is particularly interesting to me, upsetting to me, because there are a lot of lawsuits currently, a lot of reporting on how tools like ChatGPT encourage people to self-harm. I would not recommend reading the conversations that take place because they are very, very disturbing. And there have been multiple instances where people have been encouraged or led to self-harm when they're talking to their app. And that's not to say that these people, they needed help. They needed to talk to a real human being. And unfortunately, these cases can lead to very, very sad results. And then finally, inside this AI startup's plan to scan and dispose millions of books, they're just destroying art. They're destroying human creativity. They're scanning it and disposing of it so we can, copy things like AI, create AI slop off of this like art that's already created. And then, of course, there's environmental impact. So there was a story in October 2025 that talked about how Chile was embodying AI's no-win politics. It really dived into the fact that how Chile has a huge amount of data centers, and it's causing some environmental factors, some community disruptions, and people are like, this is not good for my life. And they had these before and after pictures. So there was this community in Chile called Quillacara, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. And they said, look, we are going to create this project that shows how detrimental talking to a chatbot can be, and how we should responsibly and ethically build AI tools. They don't want to say like, no data centers forever. They just want people to think about how these technologies are impacting the environment. So I was chatting to one of the guys and I was like, hey, so like, what's it like out there? He said, well, there's 6 data centers just in my community. And so I was chatting to them to try and get more information. I also showed this like liters of water that you're saving by talking to them. And finally, they also suggested you ask them certain prompts. So like find a recipe, or like what's a good recipe for ceviche? What is a good, can you draw something for me? So I asked them to draw a picture of a dog. He said, would you like Mateo, who's 9 years old, to draw this picture of a dog for you? And I said, yes, please, Mateo, draw me a picture of a dog. This is amazing. And I was having this great conversation with a real human person that looked like this little chatbot interface. It was fantastic. He says, okay, it'll take some time, but in the meantime, listen to this. And it was Who Let the Dogs Out? which was a song that I haven't listened to for like ever, and it just brought so much joy. And then finally I saw this beautiful art that was created by Mateo of this little dog, and he wanted to make it perfect, and so he sent me like multiple copies. And I said, what's the name of his dog? And they're like, oh, I don't know, maybe Pancake, which is pancake. I was like, he looks like a pancake, all right? Like, that's adorable. So it was this great human interaction where I was able to connect with somebody on the other side of the world who made me this beautiful art to better understand how people are being impacted by technologies every day. And when I saw Pancake, I got so happy because it was a human creativity and it made something real. And it reminded me of this incredible Hayao Miyazaki. It was like a documentary. It was being filmed when one of his animators showed him an AI animation. And he said, I strongly feel like this is an insult to life itself. He saw this and it was just so inhuman. And one of the best things about being human is our creativity and what we can create with our hands, with our imagination, and being able to produce with love out into the world and make people feel something. Because I don't know about you guys, but when I look at AI generated art, a lot of times I just don't feel anything. It's soulless. And because I know it's not really created by a person. And then this also reminded me, this beautiful pancake that I would like to frame and hang up in my house. This quote by Winston Churchill. This is from a talk that he gave at the Royal Academy on the 30th of April, 1938. He says, ill fares the race which fails to salute the arts with the reverence and delight which are their due. He was talking about what makes us human. He was talking about our humanity and being able to express ourselves with our human nature. And that is very, very beautiful and part of what makes us human. So to that, I add, ill fares the race which fails to salute the human-made arts with the reverence and delight which are their due. So I encourage all of you leaving this talk to think about how we're incorporating AI, what are some of those security issues that we're thinking about, but also how can we be more creative as human beings? How can we come up with new ways of doing things and creating things, and think about the value of the work that you are doing as a real person and how it's impacting your community? And maybe, I don't know, you can talk to somebody on the other side of the world that draws a little doodle of his dog for you. So thank you. That's all I have. Here are my references.